if you are creating a mythical story world, history should play some part in the process. There is much to learn about world building from Earth's own history. Civilizations rose and fell, and new ones cropped up. There have been extinctions, inventions, changes of regimes, plagues, and wars. Oftentimes the strongest side won, but not always. History shapes the present. And so the more you know about your history, the more you'll know about your story world and the place your characters live in. No need to go too far with inventing history. Keep your plot in mind and have a purpose for everything you create. What conflicts do you need to set up to make your story work? What kind of backstory? You only need to invent things that will impact your characters as they move through the story. So, the amount of history you create, it can be light or heavy, depending on the story you're trying to tell. Tolkien's Lord of the Rings is an epic tale about how the world, as the main characters know it, is almost ending. They had to stop Sauron from getting the One Ring, and therefore the history of that One Ring is really important to the story. History is used in a totally different way in a book like The Hunger Games. We get a very vague glimpse at what happened before, just enough that makes the story interesting and helps us understand what's going on and what's at stake. But we don't need any more than that. The history of English magic is used wonderfully in Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell by Susanna Clarke, and it fits the Regency era in which the story takes place. And J.K. Rowling makes an excellent use of the history of the wizarding world in her Harry Potter books, which gives information to Harry, and therefore the reader, on a need-to-know basis. Creating a timeline. When I started my first fantasy novel, I didn't know how to go about creating a history. I wanted to make it simple, so I wrote a timeline of my land. Really, it was just a timeline of one particular group of people in that land, and it began when the first king came to the land, and it ended at the time when my book began. I started with the year 0, when the first king showed up, and then I went by 10s all the way up to, actually by 5s, to the year 585, when my main character was going to be turning 16. I used Microsoft Word, and I typed in a number and a dash for every 10 years and 5 years in between, and then I added my dates, and then I started making stuff up and filling in the blanks. When kings ruled, important births and deaths, wars, explorations and discoveries, when certain cities or landmarks were built, anything that I thought might be worth remembering or might be fun to reference in the story. And so doing that made it possible for me to do that, to reference things, to reference the Great War or the Battle of Godal Wall. And later, when my character arrived in a major government fortress, I called back to some of those mentions when he walked down this hallway that had all these displays of historical armor. So that timeline gave me a reference to look back to again and again for ideas, and in case I forgot what date I said something happened. It doesn't add a whole lot to the plot necessarily, but it does add a great deal of depth and realism to your story world. If you're wanting to write an alternate history book, create a timeline with 2 columns, one for story world elements and the other for real world history elements. That way you can tie what's happening historically in with what's happening fictionally, and that will really enhance realism in your story. Write it out. I highly recommend writing out a brief history of your land. Go back as far as you want. For inspiration, look up the history of Earth and just glance at the different eras and see how we've advanced over the years. I wrote a historical narrative for the Land of Eretz in my first series, and little blurbs for each city, and I did this for my own knowledge so that I could better understand the world my characters were living in, and I also did it because I didn't know what I was doing, and it seemed like a good idea at the time. But since it was for me, it was not perfect or even wholly accurate once I had completed the series, but that kind of pre-writing can really help you come up with some interesting ideas for your world. Don't spend too much time on it. Or on history at all, because a little goes a long way, and you can always create more history if you need to when you're writing. Complicate things. History comes through the perspective of the historian who wrote it down. For example, British children are taught a slightly different version of the Revolutionary War than American children. In fact, they don't even call it the Revolutionary War, I don't think. Different countries have different ways of looking at the events that have taken place because they look at it from their own perspective. So in your story, how do different people groups remember history differently? See if you can find ways to put those kind of groups in conflict with each other in regards to your history. Don't use it. Now that you've come up with a bunch of fun history, throw it away and don't use it. That's right. Fight the urge to cut and paste whatever cool stuff you came up with and just shove it into your story where it doesn't fit. Instead, tell your character's story. If the history needs to come out, it will. Remember, you only need enough to help tell your story. Also, fight the urge to slip in those huge sections of history or have a big information dump or one of those prologues that tells the history of the land. It's much better when it happens naturally in the course of the story and has a reason to come out. Current day conflicts. A story is a series of events that starts in one place and ends in another. Ideally, it takes a character on a journey to achieve some sort of goal. Your story is going to take place in your fabulous story world, so take a look at that world. What kinds of current day conflicts have you already set up? Is there a threat to your world? A threat to a certain people group? Is the government peaceful or fighting with itself or with other countries? Is war brewing? Does your story, does the conflict involve the land in some way? Do your characters need to travel over dangerous territory? In my Blood of Kings trilogy, the curse of darkness is spreading across the land. See my logo? And that's a serious problem because it destroys the land and drives people out and drives the one who remained insane. It also started when the king was murdered years ago. And his son was left 3 years old on his own, and so he has been being raised by a guy who's a regent until then in a council, and so these guys kind of don't want to give up their power, but he's coming of age soon, and so there's lots of motivations that are clashing because some don't want to give up their power, and some don't believe he's really the prince. Some think he's a fake. And then there's territories who care nothing about all that politics. They just want to keep living on their land peacefully and stay away from all that stuff that's going on over there in the capital. So, as my characters navigate through that story and come into contact with those different people groups, that's going to add authenticity to the story. So, some examples from other books. In The Lord of the Rings, Sauron has been looking for the One Ring for quite some time, and a hobbit just happened to put it on. It put Frodo in the middle of a complex history that will threaten his life, his home, and his entire world. In The Lion and the Witch and the Wardrobe, the White Witch has been causing trouble long before the Pevensies arrive. She's always known that there was a prophecy that said, when 2 sons of Adam and 2 daughters of Eve sit in the 4 thrones at the castle of Cair Paravel, then she will be destroyed. So when she sees those guys, she's like, uh-oh. So that history, though, isn't given right away in the story, but it is a motivating factor for the White Witch's behavior the moment she meets Edmund. It's why she's so set on destroying those children, because she knows that they have come to destroy her, or that they will, even by accident. In Harry Potter, Lord Voldemort has been biding his time, building his strength, waiting to return to power. Harry learns bits and pieces over the course of a 7-book series, and the more he learns about his history, the history of his parents and Voldemort, the more he understands what he is up against and what must be done in order to stop his enemy for good. If we'd had all that information in the book 1, it wouldn't have been as cool. So the conflicts in all these books were set up by the history of each story world. Long before the characters were introduced in the actual story began, the author knew what was going to be happening. That's what you want to achieve with your history. You want to have created a history that's necessary to set your characters up so that the plot can happen in the most realistic and engaging way. So, any questions? Leave them in the comments and I will do my best to brainstorm with you. Until next time, keep on writing.